Chapter 6. The Execution of Jesus. The Passion of Jesus Christ. Christians often refer to the events leading to Jesus' crucifixion as the Passion of Jesus Christ. In modern parlance, passion has come to mean feelings of strong emotion. The term passion comes from the Greek word to suffer, pascho, an obsolete meaning in modern English. The Passion of Jesus Christ refers to his suffering and death. Each of the Gospels describes Jesus' crucifixion and the events leading to it. There are minor variations in the detail among them. However, they all tell the same overarching story of what occurred that day. Some variation in detail can be expected in eyewitness accounts separately recorded as mentioned previously. The most detailed Gospel passages have been selected and conjoined for this narrative. A medical commentary follows. Jesus ate his Last Supper with his disciples on the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, Mark 14, verse 12. Passover was a one-day religious holiday which marked the beginning of the week-long Feast of Unleavened Bread. Passover plus the Feast of Unleavened Bread could also be collectively referred to as the Passover, Exodus 45, verse 21, and Luke 22, verse 1. The Gospels are clear in stating Jesus' Last Supper was a Passover Seder, Matthew 26, verse 18, Mark 14, verse 14, and Luke 22, verse 15. Jesus used the context of Passover to teach his disciples the significance of his death. Additionally, he expanded the meaning of Passover and instituted a new celebratory meal which Christians celebrate as the Eucharist or Holy Communion. The crucifixion of Jesus was on a Friday since it occurred on the day of preparation for the Sabbath. Sabbath is observed on Saturday each week. In John's Gospel it states, that Sabbath was an especially important one, indicating that this particular Sabbath occurred during a religious festival, John 19, verse 31. The exact date of Jesus' crucifixion has been the subject of debate for centuries. The most accepted options fulfilling the day-to-day sequence described in the Bible are either April 7th, AD 30, and April 3rd, AD 33. Friday, April 7th, AD 30 is considered by many to be the most favored date of Jesus' execution. The Gospel narrative of Jesus' execution, about 7 p.m., Jesus' Last Supper with his disciples, Mark 14, 17-26. Then when it was evening, he came to the house with the 12. While they were at the table eating, Jesus said, I tell you the truth, one of you eating with me will betray me. They were distressed, and one by one said to him, Surely not I. He said to them, It is one of the 12, one who dips his hand with me into the bowl. For the Son of Man will go as it is written about him, but woe to that man by whom the Son of Man is betrayed. It would be better for him if he had never been born. While they were eating, he took bread, and after giving thanks he broke it, gave it to them, and said, Take it, this is my body. And after taking the cup and giving thanks, he gave it to them, and they all drank from it. He said to them, This is my blood, the blood of the covenant, that is poured out for many. I tell you the truth, I will no longer drink of the fruit of the vine until that day when I drink it new in the kingdom of God. After singing a hymn, they went out to the Mount of Olives. Peter's denial foretold, Mark 14:27-31. Then Jesus said to them, You will all fall away, for it is written, I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep will be scattered. But after I am raised, I will go ahead of you into Galilee. Peter said to him, Even if they all fall away, I will not. Jesus said to him, I tell you the truth today, this very night, before a rooster crows twice, you will deny me 3 times. But Peter insisted emphatically, Even if I must die with you, I will never deny you. And all of them said the same thing. About 9 p.m., the prayer on the Mount of Olives, Luke 22:39-46. Then Jesus went out and made his way, as he customarily did, to the Mount of Olives, and the disciples followed him. When he came to the place, he said to them, Pray that you will not fall into temptation. He went away from them about a stone's throw, knelt down and prayed, Father, if you are willing, take this cup away from me. Yet not my will, but yours be done. Then an angel from heaven appeared to him and strengthened him, and in his anguish he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat was like drops of blood falling to the ground. When he got up from prayer, he came to the disciples and found them sleeping, exhausted from grief. So he said to them, "Why are you sleeping? Get up and pray that you will not fall into temptation." About midnight. The betrayal and arrest of Jesus. John 18, 1-11. There was an orchard there, and he and his disciples went into it. Now Judas, the one who betrayed him, knew the place too, because Jesus had met there many times with his disciples. So Judas obtained a squad of soldiers and some officers of the chief priests and Pharisees. They came to the orchard with lanterns and torches and weapons. Then Jesus, because he knew everything that was going to happen to him, came and asked them, "Who are you looking for?" They replied, "Jesus the Nazarene." He told them, "I am he." Now Judas, the one who betrayed him, was standing there with them. So when Jesus said to them, "I am he," they retreated and fell to the ground. Then Jesus asked them again, "Who are you looking for?" And they said, "Jesus the Nazarene." Jesus replied, "I told you that I am he. If you are looking for me, let these men go." He said this to fulfill the word he had spoken, "I have not lost a single one of those whom you gave me." Then Simon Peter, who had a sword, pulled it out and struck the high priest's slave, cutting off his right ear. Now the slave's name was Malchus. But Jesus said to Peter, "Put your sword back into its sheath. Am I not to drink the cup that the Father has given me?" Jesus before the high priest and Sanhedrin. Mark 14, 53-65. Then they led Jesus to the high priest, and all the chief priests and elders and experts in the law came together. And Peter had followed him from a distance, up to the high priest's courtyard. He was sitting with the guards and warming himself by the fire. The chief priests and the whole Sanhedrin were looking for evidence against Jesus so that they could put him to death, but they did not find anything. Many gave false testimony against him, but their testimony did not agree. Some stood up and gave this false testimony against him. We heard him say, "I will destroy this temple made with hands, and in 3 days build another not made with hands." Yet even on this point their testimony did not agree. Then the high priest stood up before them and asked Jesus, "Have you no answer? What is this that they are testifying against you?" But he was silent and did not answer. Again the high priest questioned him, "Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed One?" "I am," said Jesus. "And you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the power and coming with the clouds of heaven." Then the high priest tore his clothes and said, "Why do we still need witnesses? You have heard the blasphemy. What is your verdict?" They all condemned him as deserving death. Then some began to spit on him and to blindfold him and to strike him with their fists, saying, "Prophesy." The guards also took him and beat him. Peter's denial of Jesus. Mark 14, 66-72. Now while Peter was below in the courtyard, one of the high priest's slave girls came by. When she saw Peter warming himself, she looked directly at him and said, "You also were with that Nazarene, Jesus." But he denied it. "I don't even understand what you're talking about." Then he went out to the gateway, and a rooster crowed. When the slave girl saw him, she began again to say to the bystanders, "This man is one of them." But he denied it again. A short time later the bystanders again said to Peter, "You must be one of them because you are also a Galilean." Then he began to curse, and he swore with an oath, "I do not know this man you are talking about." Immediately a rooster crowed a second time. Then Peter remembered what Jesus had said to him, "Before a rooster crows twice, you will deny me 3 times." And he broke down and wept. 6:30 a.m. Jesus before Pilate. Mark 15, 1-5. Early in the morning, after forming a plan, the chief priests with the elders and the experts in the law and the whole Sanhedrin tied Jesus up, led him away, and handed him over to Pilate. So Pilate asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" He replied, "You say so." Then the chief priests began to accuse him repeatedly. So Pilate asked him again, "Have you nothing to say? See how many charges they are bringing against you." But Jesus made no further reply, so that Pilate was amazed. Jesus before Herod Antipas. Luke 23, 5:12. But they persisted in saying, "He incites the people by teaching throughout all Judea. It started in Galilee and ended up here." Now when Pilate heard this, he asked whether the man was a Galilean. When he learned that he was from Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him over to Herod, who also happened to be in Jerusalem at that time. When Herod saw Jesus, he was very glad, for he had long desired to see him because he had heard about him and was hoping to see him perform some miraculous sign. So Herod questioned him at considerable length. Jesus gave him no answer. The chief priests and the experts in the law were there, vehemently accusing him. Even Herod with his soldiers treated him with contempt and mocked him. Then, dressing him in elegant clothes, Herod sent him back to Pilate. That very day, Herod and Pilate became friends with each other, for prior to this they had been enemies. The death of Judas, Matthew 27, 3-10. Now when Judas, who had betrayed him, saw that Jesus had been condemned, he regretted what he had done and returned the 30 silver coins to the chief priests and the elders, saying, "I have sinned by betraying innocent blood." But they said, "What is that to us? You take care of it yourself." So Judas threw the silver coins into the temple and left. Then he went out and hanged himself. The chief priests took the silver and said, "It is not lawful to put this into the temple treasury, since it is blood money." After consulting together, they bought the potter's field with it, as a burial place for foreigners. For this reason, that field has been called the field of blood to this day. Then what was spoken by Jeremiah the prophet was fulfilled. They took the 30 silver coins, the price of the one whose price had been set by the people of Israel, and they gave them for the potter's field, as the Lord commanded me. Jesus again before Pilate, John 18:28-38. So Pilate came outside to them and said, "What accusation do you bring against this man?" They replied, "If this man were not a criminal, we would not have handed him over to you." Pilate told them, "Take him yourselves and pass judgment on him according to your own law." The Jewish leaders replied, "We cannot legally put anyone to death." This happened to fulfill the word Jesus had spoken when he indicated what kind of death he was going to die. Pilate questions Jesus. So Pilate went back into the governor's residence, summoned Jesus, and asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus replied, "Are you saying this on your own initiative, or have others told you about me?" Pilate answered, "I am not a Jew, am I? Your own people and your chief priests handed you over to me. What have you done?" Jesus replied, "My kingdom is not from this world. If my kingdom were from this world, my servants would be fighting to keep me from being handed over to the Jewish authorities. But as it is, my kingdom is not from here." Then Pilate said, "So you are a king?" Jesus replied, "You say that I am a king. For this reason I was born, and for this reason I came into the world, to testify to the truth. Everyone who belongs to the truth listens to my voice." Pilate asked, "What is truth?" When he had said this, he went back outside to the Jewish leaders and announced, "I find no basis for an accusation against him." Jesus sentenced to death, Matthew 27:15-23. During the feast, the governor was accustomed to release one prisoner to the crowd, whomever they wanted. At that time, they had in custody a notorious prisoner named Jesus Barabbas. So after they had assembled, Pilate said to them, "Whom do you want me to release for you, Jesus Barabbas, or Jesus who is called the Christ?" For he knew that they had handed him over because of envy. As he was sitting on the judgment seat, his wife sent a message to him, "Have nothing to do with that innocent man. I have suffered greatly as a result of a dream about him today." But the chief priests and the elders persuaded the crowds to ask for Barabbas and to have Jesus killed. The governor asked them, "Which of the two do you want me to release for you?" And they said, "Barabbas." Pilate said to them, "Then what should I do with Jesus who is called the Christ?" They all said, "Crucify him." He asked, "Why? What wrong has he done?" But they shouted more insistently, "Crucify him." Jesus is condemned and mocked, Matthew 27:24-31. When Pilate saw that he could do nothing, but that instead a riot was starting, he took some water, washed his hands before the crowd, and said, "I am innocent of this man's blood. You take care of it yourselves. In reply, all the people said, "Let his blood be on us and on our children." Then he released Barabbas for them. But after he had Jesus flogged, he handed him over to be crucified. Then the governor's soldiers took Jesus into the governor's residence and gathered the whole cohort around him. They stripped him and put a scarlet robe around him, and after braiding a crown of thorns, they put it on his head. They put a staff in his right hand, and kneeling down before him, they mocked him, "Hail, King of the Jews!" They spat on him and took the staff and struck him repeatedly on the head. When they had mocked him, they stripped him of the robe and put his own clothes back on him. Then they led him away to crucify him. Walking to the crucifixion site, Luke 23:26-27, as they led him away, they seized Simon of Cyrene, who was coming in from the country. They placed the cross on his back and made him carry it behind Jesus. A great number of the people followed him, among them women who were mourning and wailing for him. 9 a.m., the crucifixion, John 19:16-27. Then Pilate handed him over to them to be crucified. So they took Jesus, and carrying his own cross, he went out to the place called the Place of the Skull, called in Aramaic Golgotha. There they crucified him along with two others, one on each side, with Jesus in the middle. Pilate also had a notice written and fastened to the cross, which read, "Jesus the Nazarene, the King of the Jews." Thus, many of the Jewish residents of Jerusalem read this notice, because the place where Jesus was crucified was near the city, and the notice was written in Aramaic, Latin, and Greek. Then the chief priests of the Jews said to Pilate, "Do not write, 'The King of the Jews,' but rather, 'This man said, I am King of the Jews.'" Pilate answered, "What I have written, I have written." Now when the soldiers crucified Jesus, they took his clothes and made 4 shares, one for each soldier, and the tunic remained. Now the tunic was seamless, woven from top to bottom as a single piece. So the soldiers said to one another, "Let's not tear it, but throw dice to see who will get it." This took place to fulfill the scripture that says, "They divided my garments among them, and for my clothing they threw dice." So the soldiers did these things. Now standing beside Jesus' cross were his mother's sister, Mary the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene. So when Jesus saw his mother and the disciple whom he loved standing there, he said to his mother, "Woman, look, here is your son." He then said to his disciple, "Look, here is your mother." From that very time the disciple took her into his own home. Noontime, the darkness, Luke 23, verse 44. It was now about noon, and darkness came over the whole land until 3 in the afternoon, because the sun's light failed. 3 p.m., death of Jesus, Mark 15:33-39. Around 3 o'clock, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, "Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani," which means, my God, why have you forsaken me?" When some of the bystanders heard it, they said, "Listen, he is calling for Elijah." Then someone ran, filled a sponge with sour wine, put it on a stick, and gave it to him to drink, saying, "Leave him alone. Let's see if Elijah will come to take him down." But Jesus cried out with a loud voice and breathed his last, and the temple curtain was torn in two from top to bottom. Now when the centurion, who stood in front of him, saw how he died, he said, "Truly this man was God's son." The piercing of Jesus' side, John 19:31-37. Then, because it was the day of preparation, so that the bodies should not stay on the crosses on the Sabbath, for that Sabbath was an especially important one, the Jewish leaders asked Pilate to have the victims' legs broken and the bodies taken down. So the soldiers came and broke the legs of the 2 men who had been crucified with Jesus, first the one and then the other. But when they came to Jesus and saw that he was already dead, they did not break his legs. But one of the soldiers pierced his side with a spear, and blood and water flowed out immediately. And the person who saw it has testified, and his testimony is true, and he knows that he is telling the truth, so that you also may believe. For these things happened so that the scripture would be fulfilled, not a bone of his will be broken. And again another scripture says, They will look on the one whom they have pierced. Medical commentary. Sweating blood. Sweating blood, called hematidrosis in medical terminology, is a rarely observed phenomenon. It is the spontaneous discharge of blood through the skin, that is, sweating blood. Descriptions and symptoms vary. In some people, the skin can become sensitive and blood expressible from the skin. Others experience less pronounced manifestations, for example, blood-tinged sweat. A handful of cases have been evaluated with modern medical technology, but the etiology, or exact medical cause, remains unknown. Thus, the pathophysiology of hematidrosis is still a medical mystery. Case reports in medical literature are of patients with recurrent episodes of hematidrosis, making them somewhat unlike Jesus, who experienced only one episode prior to his execution. Anxiety or fear appear to be triggering factors. For example, a 10-year-old girl in India developed hematidrosis after seeing her elder sister being abducted. Recurrent hematidrosis typically subsides when patients are treated with medications for anxiety. A 14-year-old Thai girl was hospitalized for recurrent hematidrosis. She had frequent episodes of bleeding from the scalp, palms, trunk, and legs. She underwent thorough medical evaluation. Extensive laboratory testing was normal. Biopsy showed that blood cells collected in vacuoles in the dermis, an underlayer of the skin, or in hair follicles. How these spaces became filled with blood remained unclear, however, since there were no adjacent blood vessels. Electron microscopy was without evidence of vasculitis, that is, inflammation of the blood vessels, or alteration in blood vessel structure. Blood extruded from the vacuoles directly through the skin or through hair follicles, but not through sweat glands. This caused the appearance of sweating blood, but sweat glands were not involved. After the hematidrosis stopped, the empty vacuoles collapsed without leaving scars. In a similar case, a 21-year-old woman was hospitalized for repetitive episodes of hematidrosis. There was no apparent cause for the bleeding episodes. Laboratory testing was normal, specifically without any evidence of a bleeding disorder. Unlike the prior case, skin biopsies in this patient were normal. A physiological source for her hematidrosis could not be identified. This patient's medical history was notable for major depression and panic disorder. Hematidrosis episodes subsided when she was treated with propranolol, a medication sometimes used to treat anxiety. Both of these patients had been hospitalized for observation and testing. There was no evidence of self-inflicted wounds. Had self-inflicted causes for bleeding been present, it would have been evident on biopsy. Thorough medical evaluation was performed. Laboratory testing was normal for both, specifically without evidence of any bleeding disorder. In spite of thorough medical evaluation, the pathophysiology of their hematidrosis could not be identified. However, anxiety appears to have been a contributing triggering factor in each case. Jesus experienced extreme emotional distress the night before his execution. He had premonition of his crucifixion and had warned his disciples about his impending execution, but they didn't seem to understand. Matthew 20:17-19, Mark 10, verse 33-34, and Luke 9, verse 22. Jesus' disciples couldn't fathom the idea that the man they believed to be the Messiah could suffer such an ignominious death. Jesus had seen people crucified. He understood the extreme torture he was about to experience. The rarest form of hematidrosis is single-episode psychogenic hematidrosis and is associated with the fear of death prior to execution. There are only a handful of reported cases of this kind. That Jesus sweat blood indicates he had clear understanding of the horror he was about to experience. It is interesting that only Luke, a physician, wrote about Jesus sweating blood. He must have considered it a significant detail. Fluid deprivation. During times of emotional distress, sweating is increased due to increased elevated circulating catecholamines in the blood. Catecholamines are hormones made by the adrenal glands. This is caused by sympathetic nervous system activation and commonly called a fight-or-flight response, or an adrenaline rush. A high state of anxiety and sweating would contribute to dehydration. Jesus would have been without food or water for at least 12 hours prior to being placed on the cross. We can safely assume that Jesus would have been deprived of anything to eat or drink after his arrest. Symptoms of dehydration could include thirst, dry mouth, headache, dizziness, confusion, muscle cramps, and heart palpitations. Severity of Jesus' beating. Jesus' beatings were particularly severe, beyond what a condemned prisoner would ordinarily experience. Jesus was beaten by Jewish temple guard soldiers prior to being placed into Roman custody. He was then again beaten and scourged by Roman soldiers. The, quote, whole cohort, end quote, of Roman soldiers participated in mocking and severely beating him. He was severely flogged, spit on, blindfolded, and hit with a rod used as a mock royal scepter. Matthew 27, 27-31, John 19, 1-3. The severity of Jesus' initial beatings while in Jewish custody should not be overlooked. Thomas McGovern, M.D., makes an interesting observation about Luke's description of Jesus' first beating while in Jewish custody. From Luke's Gospel, now the men who were holding Jesus under guard began to mock him and beat him. Luke 22, verse 63. Luke uses the Greek verb durantes for the phrase, and beat him. The Greek root of this word is the same for skin, derma, and carries the primary meaning of to flay the skin. To beat is a secondary meaning. When the word is used to describe a beating or whipping, it implies a heightened severity of thrashing and cudgeling. Luke, as a physician, seems to use specific language to precisely describe the severity of Jesus' beating. Since the Sanhedrin would have executed Jesus if they had opportunity to do so, it seems likely that his beating from the temple guard would have been particularly severe. The maximum penalty short of death by Jewish law was 40 stripes, Deuteronomy 25, verse 3. Jewish courts had autonomy in corporal punishment and could lash offenders at their discretion without Roman interference. Roman soldiers were free to beat condemned prisoners without restriction, the only stipulation being that the prisoner should not be beaten to death prior to crucifixion. Accordingly, it is traditionally held that Jesus was scourged twice. The first beating was in the home of Caiaphas the high priest, the second by Roman soldiers under order of Pontius Pilate. The scourging pillar from the home of Caiaphas is said to be in the chapel of the apparition of Jesus to his mother, in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. The scourging pillar used by Pilate's soldiers is believed to be in the Church of Santa Prassede in Rome. Roman scourging. Roman soldiers scourged all condemned prisoners prior to execution. Jesus' scourging was more severe than usual due to the particular disdain exhibited by the Roman soldiers. Romans were known to have anti-Semitic sentiments which would have been heightened by thinking of Jesus as a political insurgent. The obvious immediate effect of scourging would be intense and diffuse pain. This would have caused further sweating, rapid breathing, and heartbeat from the fight-or-flight physiologic response to pain. Roman scourging caused blunt trauma, contusions, and lacerations all over the body. This would have caused significant blood loss from the cuts and tears in his flesh, as well as bruising from blunt trauma. See Chapter 5 for discussion of Roman crucifixion practices. Lung injury. Scourging and blunt trauma to the chest wall can cause injury to the lungs. This can include several possible types of injury. The lungs themselves can become bruised, called pulmonary contusion, with blood and fluid collecting within the lung tissue, sometimes called a traumatic wet lung. The lung can also collapse, called pneumothorax. Fluid can collect around the lungs, called a pleural effusion. Fluid around the lungs is typically clear, but could have a bloody appearance if bleeding occurred or if there was a penetrating wound to the chest. Dr. Frederick Zugibe describes the autopsy of a murder victim beaten to death with a belt and an electric cord. The victim had a collapsed lung, pneumothorax, as well as bruising and bleeding within the lungs. Scourging prior to crucifixion would be equally, if not more, severe. Water and blood from the chest wound. The description of water and blood flowing from Jesus' side has been a point of controversy. Early theologians struggled with possible figurative or spiritual meanings. Origen, a 3rd century theologian and church father, believed that blood would clot in a dead body, and therefore concluded the water and blood emanating from Jesus' chest wound was a miraculous sign. We now understand that the literal description of water and blood coming from Jesus' chest wound can be readily explained medically. Roman soldiers knew how to deliver a death blow. In the Greek text, John used the word pleura, Greek for rib, to indicate the location of the spear wound, translated side, John 19, verse 34. The spear would have entered Jesus' chest wall between the ribs. John does not say which side of the chest the spear entered, but it is considered to have been the right side, since the right side of the heart would be more likely to have a reservoir of blood at the moment of death. Pleural effusion, namely fluid around the lung, generally has a clear appearance and would be described as water by someone in the ancient world. When the spear ruptured the heart, blood would mix with fluid in the chest and give the appearance of blood emanating from the chest wound. Seeing water and blood come from Jesus' chest seemed peculiar to those who watched him die. However, no miracle is necessary to explain the appearance of water and blood emanating from Jesus' chest wound. The biblical description of a spear impaling Jesus' chest is taken to be accurate from a medical perspective. Early signs of shock. Shock occurs because of decreased blood perfusion to the organs and tissues of the body. In traumatic hemorrhagic shock, seemingly the case with Jesus, shock occurs from decreased circulating blood volume due to injury and bleeding. Symptoms can include confusion, lightheadedness, feeling cold and clammy, weakness, and extreme thirst. Jesus was unable to carry the short horizontal section of the cross, the patibulum, about 60 pounds, or approximately 27 kilograms, to the execution site, something that would have been expected of him. Since no Roman would be willing to carry the patibulum, Simon of Cyrene, an innocent bystander, was recruited to carry the patibulum for Jesus, Matthew 27, verse 32. Jesus was in a weakened condition from the effects of multiple beatings, fluid deprivation, and blood loss. More likely than not, he was in early stages of shock prior to being lifted onto the cross, see chapter 7 for further discussion about shock, pronounced dead. It is an unwelcome task for those in the medical profession to pronounce the death of a patient. There are certifications and statutory filings required with the cessation of human life that require some training and medical understanding. However, the determination that death has occurred is straightforward and obvious. Recognizing that life has ceased does not require a medical degree. It can be assumed that the Roman soldiers overseeing Jesus' execution would have credible expertise and experience in the pronouncement of death. To err and allow a capital criminal to escape the death sentence would have dire consequences for the centurion and his soldiers. It was the centurion's job to verify the death of each prisoner. Verification of Jesus' death was provided to Pontius Pilate prior to release of Jesus' remains for burial, for example, Mark 15, 43-46. It can be reasonably concluded that Jesus was dead prior to the stab wound. However, a spear plunged through his chest gave the Roman soldiers further assurance that Jesus was unquestionably dead.